Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What are some of the problems confronting the United Nations in the areas of peace and security, economic and social development, and human rights? How does the United Nations communicate these issues to the general public, the media, and policymakers? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations and how it communicates with the media, policymakers, and the general public about the myriad of issues it deals with. And a large number of these issues touch 7.2 billion people every day. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Stephane Dujarric. Stéphane Dujarric was the spokesperson under UN Secretary General Kofi Annan from July 1, 2005 to 31 December 2006. In the spring of 2008, Mr. Dujarric joined the United Nations Development Program as senior advisor and spokesman and was subsequently appointed UNDP's Director of Communications. In March 2011, he was appointed as the Director of News and Media in the United Nations Department of Public Information. Stéphane Dujarric, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Bill, it's absolutely great to be here and great to be back with you.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's jump right into it, Stéphane. What exactly does the Department of Public Information do, and then what do you do in the News and Media Division?
Well, the Department of Public Information, as its name would imply, is there to propagate the message of the UN to a global audience. It's quite a task. We need to communicate in many languages. We need to communicate not only the messages that are important to the UN, but obviously also the actions of the UN. The part that I run, the News and Media Division, is what I like to think is sort of the news machine of the United Nations. We produce every day radio in 8 languages, the 6 official languages of the United Nations, which are, as I'm sure you know, but maybe your viewers may not, Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, Russian, English, and French. We also do Swahili. We do Portuguese radio, all of that updated every day of the week, every day of the year. We also run the UN news websites, the UN.org and all its affiliates. In the 6 languages, we run more news-driven websites to update people on what's going on at the UN. The photo department, the television, as you see on here on this this brand new set we've recently built. We also produce features, documentary features. We run a lot of the social media accounts, especially the non-English language social media accounts. We're very active in Spanish, extremely active in Chinese on social media. We also deal with all the press releases of all the activities that are going on here at the UN. And we run the logistics for the journalists, the accreditation, make sure they have office space, and manage their sort of day-to-day activities. And I hope I didn't forget any of the things I'm supposed to manage, but I think that's about it.
It's
quite
a plateful.
Exactly.
It certainly is.
Exactly.
Well, it's a very important operation that you have. Now, our viewers can go to www.un.org to get more information about it. They can tap into your website and go over to the news center and learn a lot more.
The UN.org is really the portal for the whole United Nations. We run that in 6 languages, and from there they can navigate, look at our radio programs, our news centers, the photos, take a look at some of our television programs, which are broadcast throughout the world in multiple languages. So every day we're really out there trying to get the UN's message out and also to show the impact of the organization. It is a global organization, and people need to feel connected to it. And really, that is the aim of the work that we do every day.
Mm-hmm. And its programs do impact people around the world, without a doubt. We're touched by UN programs so often we're not aware of. Even some of the more, I won't say routine, but some of the ones we never hear about, such as helping to move aircraft and ships
Well,
and mail and weather information around the world.
Exactly. You know, in this globalized world, the UN, especially through what we call the specialized agencies, the ones that focus on postal service, on telecommunications, on aviation, on maritime issues, is really the kind of the backbone and the legal backbone through which countries can conduct business. And we know that the economy is so dependent on global trade, and these UN organizations provide a common language and a common agreement on how to conduct business. How do we make sure that a Korean airliner can land safely at Los Angeles International Airport? That's thanks to the International Civil Aviation Organization, which ensures that there are some common rules and regulations for all to follow. Same thing for a letter. The Universal Postal Union, which in fact predates the United Nations itself, ensures that post offices throughout the world can communicate, and letters can get from Samoa to Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and these are services we take for granted. We know they're there, somebody's doing it, but we don't think it's the UN, but in actuality it is.
I mean, partly it's our fault because I think we don't communicate enough about the kind of the everyday work of the UN, because it's not very sexy, it's not always very exciting, but it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's jump into some of the other issues. You were talking about the airlines moving around the world and that type of thing, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And just recently I read where ICAO was bringing together the airlines of the world to focus on reducing their carbon footprint, because airplanes leave a huge carbon footprint, as we're all aware. And that brought to mind about one of the 5 major areas of emphasis of the current Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and he's now into his second 5-year term, and one of those areas is sustainable development. This is an extremely important area. We saw recently where the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report number 5 came out, where the scientists said they are 95% sure that humans are causing a large part of the carbon dioxide in the air, the warming of the earth, and that type of thing. Why is it important for us to look at these reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was set up by the UN in 1988, to look at those and take them to heart and to be involved in this whole climate change discussion? And what has the UN done, and what will it do, I guess?
Well, I mean, climate change is something that impacts us all. It's not just rising global temperatures, it's extreme weather events. We've seen it right here in New York. I think we're 2 days past the 1-year anniversary of the Great Sandy Storm, which battered the Northeast and did even more damage in the Caribbean. These are the sorts of extreme weather patterns that we are going to see increasingly. Now, these not only impact people's lives, but they have a huge economic impact. And so what we need in order to address climate change is a binding political commitment. And is really what Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has been putting a lot of effort into over the last 6 years of his term. And that is from raising public awareness, becoming the first Secretary General to visit both the South and North Poles to show and illustrate the melting of the ice caps, to really pushing world leaders to come together and to agree on a binding commitment to ensure that global temperature doesn't rise more than 2 degrees Celsius. And it's really the UN in its convening power of bringing leaders together and giving them the scientific evidence. And that's why this panel is so important, because it's not an American report, a French report, or a South African report. It is really the world's best scientists, the world's best climatologists coming together from all over the world to agree on what the science is. And those scientific facts, we hope, will give the politicians the tools to make the tough decisions.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the officials and people who study this topic believe firmly that had it not been for the efforts of Ban Ki-moon focusing the spotlight on climate change, had it not been for UN conferences such as UN Conference on Environment and Development in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, the 2012 Conference on Post-Rio plus 20 Sustainable Development Conference, that the whole climate change issue would not be where it is today. We would not be discussing it and studying it the way we are.
No, clearly it's something the Secretary General has been pushing out there. very, very publicly. And you know, these conferences go on regularly. We have one coming up in Warsaw in about 2 weeks, which the Secretary General will attend. As you say, we've had some in Rio. The political process is a long process. It's a frustrating process. The diplomatic process can be long and tedious and negotiate. So the glacial pace of that movement can be a little frustrating. And the UN's role, the Secretary General's role, is to keep the pressure on the process so global leaders can come to a decision and come to a binding agreement on climate change and to limit the impact of climate change, which we're seeing every day in developing countries and in developed countries.
And of course, another goal of the Secretary General is to mitigate conflicts. And of course, there are several conflicts around the world right now. One of the most, I guess, frustrating ones to deal with is in Syria right now. And we see that it's almost as though there have been two UN systems operating in Syria. You have the Security Council, which is now, they did pass a resolution allowing the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons into the country, which was a very good move to help get the chemical weapons taken out from Bashar al-Assad's area. But also, while this was going on, that frustration maybe at the Security Council when they couldn't get a vote through because a member or two wanted to block it, but you had the other part of the UN, the humanitarian part of the UN, that's been on the ground since day one, the World Food Program, the UN Children's Fund, UN High Commission for Refugees. What type of role do they play in helping Syrians who are on the move, Syrians who are refugees, Syrians who are in a war zone?
Well, I think you've illustrated, by bringing up the Syria example and the way you've done, you've really illustrated the two parts of the UN. There's the UN as the stage, right? The UN providing the stage for representatives of governments to argue their position and hopefully come to some agreement. Sometimes, like we see in Syria, they're unable to come to an agreement. Meanwhile, you have the UN as an actor, embodying the Secretary General and all our colleagues that are in the field, humanitarian, peacekeepers, development workers. So we'll see why, while there is a diplomatic deadlock, it doesn't stop the UN's as an actor part of working on the ground. And what we see in Syria is a humanitarian tragedy, tragic on any scale. Out of a country of 21 million people, almost 7 million Syrians are in need of help. We have more than 2 million Syrians who are refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Turkey primarily. Countries that themselves, especially Lebanon and Jordan, have their own problems, so they're absorbing a lot of people. Meanwhile, we have more than 4 million Syrians within Syria who are what we call internally displaced, sort of internal refugees, who we are trying to feed, who we're trying to house. Meanwhile, in what, by all intents and purposes, is an active war zone. And we have to work both with the government and the rebels to provide safe access. And that's been a tremendous challenge. And frankly, not all parties have lived up to their responsibilities in protecting civilians in order to allow us to give this humanitarian access. But if you go visit or see the pictures of these refugee camps, I mean, the UN teams on the ground, World Food Program, UNHCR, have really done a tremendous job in trying to create some sense of normalcy for these millions of refugees.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today, we're taking a look at the United Nations and the myriad of issues the UN deals with and how it communicates with the general public, policymakers, and the media. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Stephane Dujarric. Mr. Stephane Dujarric is the Director of News and Media in the United Nations Department of Public Information. Prior to joining the United Nations, previously Mr. Dujarric worked for ABC News for nearly 10 years with postings in New York, London, and Paris. Stephane, we're talking about the United Nations. We're hitting upon some of the key issues. Let's talk about peacekeeping. This is a major part of the United Nations. There are now about 120,000 peacekeepers, I think, that are on loan. They're not UN employees per se, but they're on loan from donor countries, and there are approximately 16 missions that may have gone up or down overnight. But let's talk about peacekeeping. This was not in the United Nations Charter in 1945 when the Charter was developed, but in 1948 there was the first peacekeeping mission that went in to observe the Israeli-Arab separation. But today, peacekeeping is a critical part, is it not, of the United Nations operations? You're in 16 mostly very dangerous areas of the world.
It is a critical part, and peacekeeping came about through the hard work of a brilliant American diplomat, Ralph Bunche, who was one of a group of original people who came to work for the United Nations, as you mentioned, in the Sinai. But it is a vital part of the work that we do to try to solidify peace in places of conflict, to try to bring peace in places of conflict. But contrary to kind of popular culture, the UN has no standing army. Whenever there is a peacekeeping mission that is approved by the UN Security Council, we have to go out and beg, hat in hand, to different countries to loan us the troops. Sometimes one country will give us the troops, another country will give us the transport, either the strategic airlift capacity or even armored personnel carriers that will be operated by troops from a third country. It's a huge logistical challenge. We have some standby agreements with certain countries, mostly Scandinavian countries, but the largest contributors to peacekeeping troops are in fact countries in the south: India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria. Those countries provide the bulk of the 120,000 peacekeepers that are deployed throughout the world, whether it's in Haiti, in Mali, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all over the world. And they do a tremendous service. But it is a challenge because, as you say, they're not the UN's troops; they're on loan, and that creates all sorts of problems.
And of course, our viewers can go to www.un.org to learn more about the topics we're talking about today: peacekeeping, climate change, just on across the board. Before we leave peacekeeping, though, this is such a vital area. I would imagine it's a real challenge. You say you have to borrow troops from other countries, and the level of training obviously is different from country to country. You have some countries probably have very well-trained, very sophisticated, very professional soldiers. Others may not be quite at that level. Is there a challenge? Do you have a training program for them to try to bring them all up to the same level?
The best way to illustrate the challenge of peacekeeping is Kofi Annan, previous Secretary General, once said. He compared it to a fire service. So you have a fire, you call the fire department, they send out the trucks. That's what happens in New York and in most countries. With peacekeeping, there's a fire, the Security Council decides to send out a peacekeeping mission. We don't send out the troops. We then have to call around, try to find the troops, try to find the fire department, the firemen, try to find the trucks, make sure that the firemen know actually how to operate the trucks, make sure everybody speaks kind of the same language or on the same process. So the deployment can take months. But what we see now increasingly is a number of the largest peacekeeping contributors train their own soldiers and the soldiers of other countries in peacekeeping. So we have that in Bangladesh. There's a peacekeeping center also in Ghana. A lot of countries are taking a very active look on how they train their soldiers to be good peacekeepers, because obviously it is a much different attitude and standpoint than the regular work of most armies.
Exactly. I know with the United States, we'll just use as an example, the United Nations basically took over the United States peacekeeping operation in Haiti several years ago. And of course, if the UN were not there today, the U.S. probably would be, or somebody else might be, just to help bring stability to the Haitian people so they can get themselves reoriented, get back on track. But there are studies that have shown in the past, done by the U.S. Government Accountability Office and others, that it's 8 times cheaper to use UN peacekeepers than it is U.S. peacekeepers. And it also, in some circumstances, it's actually more effective to use UN peacekeepers because they can be more neutral and come in and not have a flag of a particular country.
Well, I mean, exactly. You're right. There was a study done by the Rand Corporation,
exactly,
which,
that's it. Yes.
Which showed that it was, in terms of the U.S. taxpayers, much more beneficial to have a UN peacekeeping mission. But I think what you said, you hit the nail on the head. It's a question of legitimacy. When there is the UN flag flies, there is impartiality. And they know it is not just one country trying to impose something, but it is reflective of the global will of the will of the United Nations, and especially of the Security Council, to try to bring peace and security to a certain region. But the important thing to keep in mind too is that peacekeeping is just a band-aid. You know, the peacekeepers are there to solidify peace that's been negotiated, and they are then supposed to kind of withdraw and to change. The UN mission kind of changes in its nature. We go from peacekeeping to peace building, and then more to a traditional development role. It's the UN investment in these countries needs to be long term, and we've seen it in Sierra Leone and in Liberia, both countries which was racked by civil war in the 1990s. UN peacekeeping missions, and now in both those countries, the peacekeeping missions have whittled down, and it's much more peace building and a development presence. Because what we don't want to see is a quick withdrawal of the UN, of its staff, of its peacekeepers, and then a country going backwards again.
And now you've been with the United Nations. You work for Secretary General Kofi Annan, now for the 8th Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. You've seen the UN in various phases. One thing the UN has focused on for years is reform, internal reform, external reform, to become a more efficient and a more effective organization. Remember, Kofi Annan brought in the two-track approach to making some internal reforms, which he implemented many of them. What are some of the major reforms that have taken place, if you've seen them over the past 8, 9, 10 years, something like that?
I think the UN is a more transparent organization. It's a more open organization. And I think that's critical to the legitimacy of the organization. People throughout the world need to be able to see what is going on at the UN and what is being decided and by whom. And I think Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has really pushed us to become a much more transparent organization. He's also pushed a lot on mobility and encouraged staff to move around and not stay in the same unit, in the same division for too long, go to the field, come back to headquarters, and so forth. Because to really create a much more mobile and modern workforce for the organization. And I think in terms of other big reforms, what we've seen is the creation of the Human Rights Council, which replaced the Human Rights Commission, which was really a disgraced organization. And the Human Rights Council, again, in the issue of transparency, one of the most interesting things they've done is created the Universal Periodic Review, whereby every country, every 2 years or so, comes to the Human Rights Council and has its human rights record examined publicly. And again, it's about openness, it's about transparency, it's about legitimacy. On a technological thing, we've renovated the whole UN building. I mean, the organization needed reformation and the building needed renovation, so we're there on the renovation. And now, because of the technology we have, our crews from UN television broadcast live all the meetings. You know, you can go on the UN webcast page and you can watch almost all the meetings that are going on simultaneously in different languages, something that 10 years ago we couldn't do. But it's about transparency.
And there's so much going on at the United Nations every day. There are important meetings taking place, and some of them get reported by the media, but many of them do not. So one good place to find it would be www.un.org.
Exactly.
One other change that's been at the United Nations over the past several years has been to bring in non-governmental organizations, the private sector, business groups, environmental groups, labor groups. That the UN is composed of 193 member states of governments, but now there's more of an opportunity for people to be involved in helping to shape the agenda, is there not?
I think it's you're very right. And the interesting thing, the UN is a political organization of 193 member states, but the first words of the charter are not we the governments or we the states, it's we the peoples. And I think because of the growth of democracy over the last 10 years, because of the explosion of technology, we've seen that power in itself no longer rests solely in the hands of national governments. Civil organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs have a lot of power. The businesses, private foundations, they have a lot of power. Power maybe is not the right word. They have a potential for great impact, sometimes negative. But what we want to do is bring them in, bring the private sector into the United Nations to ensure that the way they do business in every country is both is ethical, is productive for them, for their profits. We understand that, but also leaves something behind where they invest, especially if they're investing in the developing world, that people live up to, have a living wage, that they are basic safety procedures in place in factories and in plants. And we have a great program here at the UN called the Global Compact, which brings together about 7,000 companies, which all promise to live up to the agreed international human rights standards.
Well, Stephane Dujarric with the Division of News and Media with the United Nations. It's a very important organization, not a perfect organization, but we need to learn more about it. I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.